Good morning. I think we'll get started. To folks who don't follow Asia, they were a bit perplexed when I told them I was having an event on the anniversary statement of the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, and they were a bit puzzled that anyone would be interested in just an anniversary statement. But clearly to people who follow Asia, they know right now it is the issue for Asia, and it certainly has a lot of ramifications, including for U.S. national security interests in Northeast Asia. And the event is really a follow-on to a number of things that the Heritage Foundation has done. In July, we had what we called the Three Ambassador Dialogue with the ambassadors from the Republic of Korea and Japan, as well as Deputy Assistant Secretary Sung Kim. And we thought that was a great success. And then following that, Jim DeMint, the Heritage Foundation president, and I had an op-ed on South Korean-Japanese relations in the Asian Wall Street Journal. So I see this as sort of the end of a trifecta on a very important issue. So we are very pleased that we have really the A-team of panelists today to discuss this important issue. And they're going to be focusing on Prime Minister Abe's statement as well as the Korean reaction and to see if there's the strong possibility of moving forward. So I think a sign of the high caliber of our panelists is that all of them could do this entire event in Japanese. But because I'm the weak link on the team, they're being kind to me and doing this in English. So we have, really, if you ever had a panel that needs no introduction, this is it. But we have Sheila Smith, who's Senior Fellow for Japan Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations, also the author of the recent book, Intimate Rivals, Japanese Domestic Politics and a Rising China, as well as previously Japan's New Politics and the U.S.-Japan Alliance. We have Michael Green, Senior Vice President for Asia, as well as the Japan Chair at CSIS, an Associate Professor at Georgetown, and the former Senior Director for Asia at the National Security Council. And Evans Revere is the non-resident Senior Fellow at Brookings, and the former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. So I've given them all sort of the same guidance, but I'm not really worried about overlap because I know they will all be looking at the issue with different takes, different analysis. But I think we'll just get into the discussion here. And just one last housekeeping: if everyone could make sure that their phones are either on silent or off, we'd greatly appreciate that. So we're going to get started with Sheila.
Thank you, Bruce. And I particularly want to thank you for your great series of discussions on this topic, but also clearly today is a wonderful opportunity and timely at that. So I'm also delighted to look out at the audience and see multiple generations in the audience, and I think that's an important statement of the importance of this relationship. I've been asked to assess the statement a little bit since I'm going first, and I think it's probably useful to start with the words. Words matter, as I said in my blog. I did write a blog piece on Friday, if you have a chance to take a peek at that. But the four expressions that were anticipated as being significant were expressions, of course, that were used in previous statements by Prime Minister Murayama and then again by Prime Minister Koizumi. So for the record, they are shinryaku, aggression, right? They are colonial domination, shokuminshi shihai. They are deep remorse, tsusetsu, nahansei. And they are apology, owabi. And I think if all of us were sitting at a panel here a week or so before the Prime Minister made that statement, we would have had a fairly lively debate about whether owabi would be included or not, just to remind you of where we were before the statement. And in fact, some in his own party, days before his statement, very publicly made the case that he should not use that word in the statement. So that's the semantics. I thought it was a signal of Abe's intent, a diplomatic intent particularly, that he included all four. I'll let others here speak to the question of his sincerity or whether or not he should have used his own subject, I, rather than speak on behalf of the Japanese people. But I do think what was interesting to me in looking at that statement is that he took a lessons learned approach. He said explicitly what had not really been said before, which is that Japanese sense of remorse and regret was embedded in their post-war diplomacy, and that the priorities that Japan had had and the principles that it had upheld were a reflection of post-war sentiment on the part of the Japanese people. And we don't need too much to go into the detail here, but obviously that's his prescription on the use of force by Japan, implicit in the Article 9 of Japan's constitution, and also the investment in peace and prosperity in Asia. He spoke to the commitment of Japan for a prosperous and peaceful Asia. So that, I think, was pretty straightforward. I thought some of the messages he had in the statement directed at the Japanese people are worth noting, the domestic political side. I don't think he held back much on acknowledging with deep grief, right, the damage that Japan had imposed on the people of Asia. I don't think he glossed that too much, but he included specific names of countries and battlefields and places. He also included twice, I think, an inclusion of the particular impact that these battlefield situations had on women. In other words, he referred, even indirectly, to the question of the trafficking of women and the sexual aggression against women in war. He spoke, though, to the quiet pride of the post-war Japanese people, which I thought was an interesting statement. We can certainly talk about it. But one piece that I wrote about in the blog that I don't think people really spent much time talking about is he spoke about the gratitude to those who had suffered at the hands of the Japanese Imperial Army for their forbearance. Their tolerance is the word he used in helping Japan regain its international standing. To my knowledge, no Japanese leader had ever said thank you to the Chinese people, right, for allowing the Japanese to be returned, for taking care of the children that were left behind, or to the POWs, for that matter, who he says in his speech personally reached out. So those were things that I thought were different. The last piece obviously has gotten some attention, and that's what he said, that he didn't think that younger Japanese, the children of this generation and their grandchildren, so he's talking about his own generation, should not be predestined to apologize. So there, in fact, is the piece of the puzzle that many of us were looking for in terms of how he would treat the future and what he thought needed to happen. Again, we should talk about that. There's a little bit of data, not a lot, but there's some data on public opinion polling inside Japan. Yomiuri put out a poll this morning, which I think is interesting. Kyodo did one a day or two ago. The Yomiuri poll this morning has a little bit more texture, so let me just give you a little sense of it. Overall, 48% of Japanese approved of the statement. 34% did not. So that's a 14% margin. It's not an overwhelming endorsement of his public of the statement, but it's a majority in favor. On the use of the word hansei, there's a bigger number. 72% of Japanese supported the use of the word hansei, or regret. When he talked about younger Japanese not being predestined to apologize, again, he got a fairly significant 63% of Japanese thought that was the right thing for him to say. On the diplomacy, and here's where our panel is most focused today, 50% of the respondents to that poll said they thought it would have no impact on Japan's diplomacy. So that's an interesting estimation. We can talk about what it means later on. Let me leave the words aside for just a second, and part of our task here is to think about the interaction between Japan and South Korea, and so we were asked to evaluate President Park's statement. I thought it was measured and thoughtful. I thought it was embedded within a broader vision for the Korean people. In other words, she did not use the commemoration simply to talk about Japan. She talked about it in terms of the future of the Koreans themselves, which I thought was also very positive. I thought it left room to work with the Abe cabinet should the two governments decide that's what they want to do, much like the Abe statement left room to work. Neither were proactive in spelling out an agenda, but I don't think the subject of commemorating the end of World War II is the place to do that. But they both left enough diplomatic wiggle room, I think. She had a much, much more positive tone than what you saw coming out of Xinhua in China initially, although that has toned down somewhat and been revised. So is it a good basis for forward movement? Well, I think the expectation that this statement and then President Park's statement on Saturday would be a formula for the future of diplomatic relations. No, I don't think that I didn't have that expectation myself. But what they did do is they did not present an additional hurdle. And I think that is the evaluation that I would give those statements. I don't think statements alone are going to drive improvement in the relationship, but I think both paid particular attention to not making this moment a moment of setback for the two countries. How should Tokyo and Seoul proceed? Let me say a few things there, and then I'll end my comments, and we can continue later on U.S. policy. But I think there's some specific moments to keep our eyes on in the days and weeks ahead. The most obvious, of course, is the September 3rd commemoration by Xi Jinping, by China, in There is some newspaper reports that still say that Mr. Abe may be going. Others say no, that's not necessarily true, so I'll leave that to our journalists in the room to enlighten us on later on. But there is also the question of whether President Park is going to go. I think the best of all possible worlds would be that both leaders found occasion to go. How they participate in the commemoration, that I think belongs to a serious conversation with Beijing about what kind of ceremony is going to be held. But I think there's an opportunity there for leadership on the part of both President Park and Prime Minister Abe. If I had my dreams, I would say they should meet together on the sidelines of that, but that may just be a little bit too ambitious. Obviously, we're looking for a bilateral meeting at some point between the two leaders. I think we shouldn't make this dependent on China, that clearly the two leaders need to make this a function of their own interests, and therefore they should be ready to call the timing and the context of that meeting. I think it will be interesting to talk about whether or not there's a trilateral summit this fall. As you know, the foreign ministers of Japan, South Korea, and China did meet this spring, which I thought was a positive. Those trilateral meetings had been postponed because of the Chinese. I hope that this fall will be an occasion for the three leaders to meet, and I hope that Seoul and Tokyo will find a way to make that meeting a positive opportunity for the relationship. Finally, of course, there's the meetings in this fall here in Washington, and I think Xi Jinping's visit in September, followed by the October visit of President Park, are also going to be very critical to setting the stage, I think, for the Japan-South Korean diplomacy. So let me stop there, and hopefully we can continue the conversation during the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Sheila. Evans, you want to pick up the ball?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for coming here, and special thanks to Bruce and Heritage for putting together this panel and this audience. It's an honor to join good friends and colleagues on this occasion. I'm not going to deliver my remarks in Japanese or Korean or Chinese, but rather in my broken New York City English, if you'll forgive me. Let me begin with just a very quick personal take on Prime Minister Abe's statement, which I found as the latest, somewhat halting, very complex, and occasionally problematic step in Japan's ongoing attempt to try to deal with its troubled history and with its resentful neighbors. But despite the statement's faults, which I'll talk about in just a moment, I have an inkling that the statement may yet contribute in some way to an easing of tensions between Japan and Korea if both sides handle it well. And if the opportunities, and I think there are some opportunities in the statement, if the opportunities presented by the statement are wisely exploited. Importantly, and despite some of the criticism that's been leveled against the statement, I think the statement probably will not make things worse between Japan and Korea. It might, in fact, just make them better, and I'll talk about that some more in just a second. The statement, for those of you who haven't read it, is rather long, 3 times longer than the 1995 Moriyama statement on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. That statement, the Moriyama statement, of course, was really the high water mark of post-war Japanese apologies. The length of the Abe statement, plus the fact that it was cabinet endorsed, suggested to me that this was Prime Minister Abe's effort to try to make this the definitive Japanese word on the war, on the legacy of that conflict, and on the issue of apologies. Only time will tell whether that will become the case, since a future Japanese government at some point may have more or might have less to say. The content of the statement also made very clear, as Sheila's already pointed out, that the Prime Minister was trying to eliminate the need for future generations of innocent Japanese to have to apologize for the sins of their fathers and grandfathers. Unfortunately for the Prime Minister, in my view, the shortcomings of the statement, I think, pretty much guarantee that Tokyo has not heard the last of calls from the region, particularly from Korea, for further apologies. But having said that, I don't think that that means that relations between Tokyo and Seoul are destined to remain in the depressing funk in which they've been mired during the tenures of the Prime Minister and his counterpart, ROK President Park. But I'll have more to say on that in just a moment. For all of its faults, the Prime Minister's statement is better than we had reason to expect, certainly that I had reason to expect, and Sheila has already made that point. But it's also not as forward-leaning on some issues as some of us had wished. Abe's well-known reluctance to apologize to Japan's neighbors, his support in Japan from those holding rather nationalistic views, his past quibbling over whether Japan really committed aggression during World War II, and his denial of official Japanese involvement in the sexual enslavement of the so-called comfort women. All of those things gave us ample reason in recent months to fear that this year's anniversary statement might be quite deficient and even troubling in a number of respects. But the Prime Minister surprised us, including by using the word aggression and making clear that it was Japanese aggression that he was talking about in his statement. And he also threw in, for good measure, the other words that Sheila mentioned: colonial domination, deep remorse, and apology for good measure. In doing so, I think he passed an important test, since I think very few critics thought that these words would ever pass this Prime Minister's lips. Nonetheless, the extensive use of the passive voice in the statement, and if you haven't read it, you really should. It's artfully done. And the device that he used of citing the apologies of previous governments rather than delivering his own direct and personal apology gave the impression that the Prime Minister was trying to stay at least half a step, maybe a full step, removed from the level of contrition and responsibility that had been conveyed in earlier Japanese government and cabinet statements. But having said that, I think we can take some comfort in the fact that the Prime Minister highlighted the very contrite statements of his predecessors, and he also reminded us that Japan has, in fact, repeatedly stated its deep remorse and heartfelt apologies over the years. But perhaps most importantly, in my view, Abe endorsed all of the previous cabinet statements, including those that he had been explicitly or implicitly critical of in the past. That's important. And I think in doing so, he obviously associated himself with those statements. And by describing these statements as unshakable, a very interesting choice of words there, I think the Prime Minister has made those words of all those previous statements, including his own, of remorse, apology, contrition, etc. He's made all of those words the new foundation for future Japanese government pronouncements on the issue of wartime responsibility. That's another significant development. My take is that all of this is something that the Republic of Korea can and the Republic of Korea should interpret positively as evidence that the Prime Minister is willing to accept the verdicts of his prime ministerial and cabinet predecessors. And if you look back over the many ups and downs of this Prime Minister's tenure, I think it's fair to say that the Prime Minister has come a long way towards meeting the concerns of Koreans. But has he met all of their concerns? In a word, no. And is his statement the basis for a fundamental turnabout in Japan-Korea relations? On this, I would say the jury is still out. Several things in the statement have justifiably disappointed the Koreans. They had hoped to see a specific reference to and apology for Japan's colonization of Korea. But I suspect that was probably a bridge too far, since many in Japan believe that the colonial annexation of Korea put Korea in a very different category than China, for example, requiring a very different treatment. And of course, Prime Minister Abe went out of his way to make a very specific and positive gesture towards China, but there was no such gesture forthcoming for Korea, unfortunately. The Abe statement's historiography also provided what some have described as a few cringeworthy moments, even from an American perspective, as the Prime Minister tried to explain Japan's drift to expansionism, colonialism, and war in the 1930s. And little of that content can have been very pleasant to the ears of Koreans who remember only too well the harshness of their colonial experience. But the fact that Abe's historical analysis was tempered by his admission that Japan, in his words, took the wrong course and advanced along the road to war, I think that was helpful. And coming from this particular Prime Minister, that is a sentiment and that's an admission that should be welcomed. Abe could and should have made a standalone reference to the suffering of the Korean people, instead of merely including them in a list of the many in the region who suffered. I thought that was a lost opportunity. Koreans had some reason to think that Abe might do right by them in advance of the statement. Only days before the statement, the Korean people witnessed what I thought was a very profoundly moving scene of former Japanese Prime Minister Hatoyama falling onto his knees in front of a Japanese prison in Seoul where Koreans had been incarcerated and tortured. And he fell on his knees as a gesture of apology to the many Koreans who had suffered there. And again, before the Prime Minister's statement, Koreans also heard a Prime Ministerial advisor and a former senior Japanese diplomat and friend of ours, Yukio Okamoto, describe Japan's annexation of Korea as a, quote, historical sin, unquote. Either of those gestures could have set the stage for a very magnanimous step or word by Abe, but the Prime Minister stopped somewhat short of a Korea-specific statement of apology or atonement. And also lost was an opportunity to make a specific reference to the comfort women, arguably the thorniest and most emotional issue that is complicating ties between Korea and Japan. A positive word in this regard would have gone a long way, but nevertheless, the Prime Minister's admission that the dignity and honor of women had been damaged by Japan should not be taken lightly, nor should his statement that Japan, in his words, wishes to be a country always at the side of such women's injured hearts. Such phrases like that, I think, cannot and should not be dismissed. Each of these statements potentially opens the door to a more forthcoming approach by Japan on an issue of very central importance to Korea and Koreans, and I think Korea will have a chance to hold the Prime Minister to his words in the months to come. So for all of its shortcomings that I've mentioned, and there are a few more, I think the Prime Minister's statement seems to offer Korea something it can actually work with. If Seoul is prepared to recognize how far the Prime Minister has come since early in his tenure, and particularly his endorsement of the previous Japanese official pronouncements of regret, remorse, and apology. However, Abe's attempt to relieve future generations of Japanese of the burden of apology misses, I think, an important point from the Korean perspective. For Japan to be relieved of the need for future apologies, it's important that today's expressions of remorse and regret are seen as genuine, credible, and sincere. To do so, Tokyo is going to have to make further efforts to reconcile with its Korean neighbor. And I think that is the core point of the official ROK reaction as conveyed on Saturday in President Park Geun-hye's Liberation Day remarks. President Park was very careful not to dismiss what Prime Minister Abe had tried to do the previous day in his statement. Instead, she said his statement, quote, did not quite live up to our expectations, unquote. That's a very mild criticism by recent Korean standards. And reacting to the Prime Minister's positive statements of remorse, President Park challenged his government to match with consistent and sincere actions, those are her words, its declaration that the view of history articulated by its previous cabinets will be upheld. In the Korean view, deeds are going to have to be matched with words. President Park also took note, her words again, of Prime Minister Abe's endorsement of previous official Japanese statements, and in doing so, she highlighted that one of the groups most grievously harmed by Japan's past actions were the comfort women, and she called on Japan to resolve the issue quickly. And she also restated her commitment to move towards a future of renewed cooperation and shared prosperity with Japan. And I think by reiterating the importance of bilateral friendship between the two countries and cooperation between the two countries, she seems to be leaving the door open to further improvement in ties with Tokyo, and I think that's a very positive sign. Indeed, if you look back over the recent months, the overall tone and direction of Japan-Korea relations seems to have shifted somewhat away from the acerbic comments that we've all grown used to over the last year or two, and in favor of remarks emphasizing the possibility of a more positive and future-oriented relationship. Importantly, Prime Minister Abe's statement appears to have given Korea just enough to work with as the two sides explore ways to try to improve ties and settle the various pending issues between them. Without question, in my view, let me wrap up here now, the Abe statement could have been better, and certainly more could have been said to assuage Korean sensitivities. But the good news here is that the Korean president seems to agree that Prime Minister Abe is in a much better place on matters of mutual concern than he has been. And she also seems to agree that the Abe statement contains enough to warrant further efforts to open doors, not slam them shut. I think it's too early to tell whether Seoul and Tokyo will be able to make progress on the issues that divide them. But what seems clear at this point is that in the aftermath of the Abe statement, and thanks to what I believe is President Park's very wise, very prudent, and very statesmanlike reaction to it, the two sides seem prepared to try. And then finally, as for the United States and how we should respond to all of this, I think it's obvious that we have a very strong interest in better ties between our two main Asia allies. And the United States can help by reminding both Tokyo and Seoul of the stake that they have in improved relations and, of course, of the danger of allowing ties to fester. But there is little more, in my view, than offering good advice and good offices that the United States should do. At the end of the day, Japan and the Republic of Korea themselves must conclude that the challenges they face and the values that they share are much more important than the terrible and tragic history that has continued to divide them. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Evans. Michael?
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks for inviting us, and thank you for coming. I would associate myself, I think, completely with Sheila's excellent textual analysis. And I would agree with Evans' prediction that this actually could add some momentum, not a lot, but some momentum, in Japan-Korea relations, and also his prescription about what the U.S. government can do. I never had any expectation, nor should anyone have had any expectation, that this statement would resolve this issue within Japan, with Korea, or with China, or even with the U.S. for that matter. Guen-hye famously said in the 70s, it will take 3 generations to resolve this issue. Deng Xiaoping around the same time said, we'll leave this issue to the next generation, which will be wiser. Apparently that wasn't the case. It hasn't gotten easier. In some ways it's gotten harder. But I'd start with this premise that this statement was never intended to or had any chance of resolving the history issue. A lot of the criticism of the Prime Minister's statement is premised on the need to resolve this. And I just would put it to you that that was never, for any Japanese Prime Minister, a realistic prospect. The question was, could you stop the reverse sort of backward movement? Could you create some forward momentum? And on balance, although Evan is right, there were flaws in the statement, particularly vis-a-vis the Republic of Korea. I think on balance, it modestly, and we'll see, but it modestly will add some momentum. On the politics of it, within Japan, I think that Abe aimed for the center, not the right, but the center. The Kyoto poll that Sheila cited has 45%, the more recent Yomiuri poll, 48%, Fuji Sankei, 66%, who said that they were satisfied with the statement. The key question on the apology, the Kyoto poll Sheila cited, if you aggregate people who liked what he said about the apology and people who thought there was no need to mention apology, it's 66% of the public. So I think Abe aimed for the center and generally within Japan hit the target. For those who were not happy with the statement, let's not assume that they were all Mainichi Shimbun reading liberals. That includes right-wing and conservative people who were not happy with the Prime Minister's effusive expressions of remorse. So I think he hit the center. As Sheila said, as recently as a month ago, the sort of word inside the Conte, the Prime Minister's office, was that the statement would be more or less what the Prime Minister said to the joint session of the U.S. Congress, which was less than what we heard on August 14th. So things shifted. I'm speculating, but I think there are several reasons for that. One was the Prime Minister's own intellectual journey. He spent a lot of time talking to scholars, multiple sessions with his drafters. He personally redrafted most of it, I'm told, by his speechwriter. That's one factor. Second factor is Komeito, the pacifist-leaning coalition partner. This was not Abe's statement. This was a cabinet statement. And Komeito, which, as many of you know, has a strong pacifist grassroots organization, is in the cabinet. So he needed and wanted to get Komeito on board, and he did. And I think that was important for his political standing and for his legislation in the Diet, which I'll come to in a moment. The third factor, I think, was he was, I believe, taken by many of the debates within the special commission he established to look at how Japan should approach the 70th anniversary. And if you examine who was on that commission, they were mostly centrists, center-right, Kitaoka Shinichi, Keiko Izuka from Yomiuri. These are not right-wingers. They're not liberals necessarily, but they're center-right. There was maybe one person on this list who you would consider more to the right. So this group explored multiple dimensions, if you saw the report, of this issue. And the one that I think had the biggest influence was the idea that Japan's enormous mistakes, the enormous suffering caused in Asia and to the Japanese people, did not happen because of some original sin, but happened in a context of global history. And in Germany, the recent historiography is increasingly critical of the idea that German treatments of the past focus on the idea that somehow there was an original sin in Germany, these horrible things happened, and now Germany, has in the post-war period put that original sin in a box. And I think Prime Minister Abe was keen not to perpetuate a narrative that Japan is a permanent out nation, a permanent sinner, and frankly for some good reasons geopolitically. And so this global history context mattered, and as a matter of history, accurate history, the structural factors, what happened in the international system, can't be ignored, particularly if you're going to learn something about how to prevent that from happening again in the future. And of course, it makes it a natural segue to describe what Japan has done over the last 70 years to make the international system more just. So I personally didn't have a problem with that. I thought it was historically accurate and made it possible for the Prime Minister to be more forthcoming in terms of the Hansei or reflection than previous Prime Ministers had, although he did not offer his personal apology, as Sheila and Evans mentioned. The U.S. and Australia moved within about 2 hours to issue statements. The NSC spokesman welcomed the statement. I thought perhaps it would be a caveated welcome, but it wasn't. The White House clearly put out the signal early to set the tone that they welcomed this and wanted forward movement. So did Prime Minister Tony Abbott's spokesman. I don't know this for a fact, but I'll bet you anything that was coordinated. Both the U.S. and Australia have an interest in moving forward, not ignoring the past, not freeing Japan from the need to continue working on this issue, particularly with Korea, but to make sure it didn't set the tone for Japan's position in Asia, and especially for Japan's relations with other democracies. And I thought, frankly, the statements were very influential, and probably had an impact on Seoul, which is, of course, a democracy and an ally of the U.S. and a friend of Australia. The administration here has been a little bit confused and all over the map on this issue, but I think that was an effective way to set the tone. In China, people have said the response was harsh, but if you follow what the Chinese say about this issue, it was actually fairly moderate. And some of you may have noticed that the English language Chinese statement said Japan should have apologized and should have done this and should have done that, whereas the Chinese statement said Japan must apologize, Japan must. So I don't think this is an accident, comrade. I think the Chinese are also playing to multiple audiences, saw the Washington response in particular. Since November last year, when Xi Jinping and Abe had their summit, both leaders, although there is continuing geostrategic rivalry between Japan and China, both leaders have tried to stabilize the situation for their own domestic, political, and economic reasons. I thought, like Sheila and Evan, I thought Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se's initial statement, because something had to be said initially, that actions are more important than words, was well done. I thought it was appropriate, particularly in a Japan-Korea context. And I don't think Foreign Minister Yoon expected probably there would be an apology on comfort women, and probably was ready for this and came out quickly and said that action matters. And I think that was appropriate because that piece of this, the Japan-Korea piece, is not resolved, as everyone said. And I thought President Park's statement was also well-crafted, as I think both Evans and Sheila said. From a U.S. national interest perspective, this is the toughest knot, the most important piece of this. In Japan, in some polls, Yomiuri Gallup, for example, over 80% of Japanese don't trust Korea. And from my own frequent discussions with Japanese politicians and business leaders, we're not just talking about right-wing politicians. We're not just talking about conservatives. We're talking about liberals in Japan who are frustrated with the Korean actions with respect to court cases opening up the 1965 normalization treaty and other statements. And that doesn't mean Japan should in any way be absolved from responsibility for making progress and building trust with Korea on the most sensitive issues, including the comfort women. But it is a bad dynamic. It's a bad dynamic. And, you know, I saw in this statement, the first target was the Japanese public, the second target was the U.S. and Australia and like-minded democracies, the third target was China, and then Korea was last. If you just sort of look at it, and I agree with Evans, this is a strategic mistake for Japan. Korea is critical. Yamagata Aritomo and other Meiji leaders and leaders going back centuries understood that the Korean Peninsula was a dagger aimed at the heart of Japan. I think that we will have a more rational debate about Japan-Korea relations in Japan now because of this, I hope. So now what happens? I'll just end with a few predictions, and if I'm wrong, just don't invite me back. I don't think Japanese prime ministers will apologize anymore. It is possible you will have a liberal, center-left politician come back in, but I wouldn't expect it in the next 3, 4, 5 years. I don't think anyone in the LDP on the 75th anniversary or other occasions is going to personally apologize. I think Abe probably succeeded in now putting that in the past as he wanted. I think that Abe did himself a favor in terms of the legislation on security, which has hit a lot more headwind in the public than the government expected, in part because it was framed and explained poorly, in part because of this 70th anniversary. So the fact that Komeito, the coalition partner, signed on to this statement, the fact that his support rate has gone up since the statement, I think will help him now pass the security-related legislation. We can talk about that in Q&A. I'd put it at 80 or 90% now. And I think a good 10, 20% bump in my prediction comes from this statement. I think I agree with Evan, if I understood correctly, that this adds momentum, not a lot, but some momentum. At least it reduces the headwinds for progress towards a trilateral meeting. I agree with Sheila. If they could do a trilateral meeting on the margins of the September commemorations in China, not on the day that the PLA parades its quote-unquote shock and awe intimidation of Japan weaponry. But maybe the next morning, a trilateral would actually be very, in fact, it may be the only way, in my view, Abe goes, because it's very risky for him to go and in the same news cycle have the entire Chinese theme be about shock and awe and military intimidation of Japan. But I would bet against it. I'd maybe 20, 30% chance at best. I would say there's a very good chance that before APEC in November, there is a trilateral summit among Japan, Korea, China. And I think there will be a little bit more momentum. Nobody loved the statement in Korea, but there will be a little bit more momentum towards addressing bilateral Japan-ROK issues. And the comfort women is obviously the hardest one, but it's not the only one. Will those be resolved? I don't know. There should be progress on them. But I take away from the overall dynamics and the reaction that this issue will not define Japan-Korea relations anymore. That it will be a critically important issue, but based on the merits of bilateral relations, engagement, and cooperation, there will be momentum towards a trilateral summit. But I hope, from the perspective of Japan's own interests, U.S. interests, and of course Korea interests, that there is some progress on this issue going forward. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. I know the audience is eager to get into questions, but I want to exercise my prerogative and toss one or two out. I think generally we have a positive response with a lot of caveats and things that he could have done, but I think generally a positive response from the panel, which I think reflects sort of the overall U.S. expert community. But are we grading him on a curve, and should we grade him on a curve in the sense of, given the expectations even a week ago, as you pointed out, and especially a year ago, and then predictions, whether they were always wrong or only wrong recently, of, he will never say apology, he will never embrace the statements, et cetera. So is it like a student that you have low expectations, but you give him a higher grade because of good effort, and is that right? And then conversely, are the critics grading him on perhaps a reverse curve? Had that same text been issued by a DPJ prime minister during their tenure, or by Murayama or someone else? So sort of the curve and the reverse curve. Maybe Sheila, do you want
You want me to start again? I'm happy to. It's a great question. Yeah, I think we're grading him on a curve, to be fair. But I think there's two pieces of the puzzle in which I think we ought to, and all of us have talked about it, but I'll just put it back together again. Is that statement now reflects national policy? The decision to make it a cabinet decision, I think the intellectual journey that Mike talked about, the debate inside Japan about yes, no, on which piece and which language. I think we're not just grading Prime Minister Abe. I think we're looking deeply, into how opinion in Japan is changing. And so I think I wouldn't underestimate a cross-generational impact here, and we can talk about that, I'm sure, on the South Korean side as well. So how we grade him is one piece, but I think we ought to recognize that underneath there is not just grading Abe's performance, but recognizing as well what's transforming inside Japan. And it's not a movement to the right. It is simply a generational transformation in looking at the way in which the history question continues to be part of Japan's diplomacy. The reverse curve, for the critics, I was neither critic nor praising the statement, but I think we ought to take it on its own terms, frankly. I was not a fan of tweaking at the semantics. He should have put this way, he should have said it that way, he should have said it with this. I think the semantic debate really sidestepped the core issue here, which is how does reconciliation take place in today's Asia, and particularly between Seoul and Tokyo? And is domestic leadership in both countries going to be able to overcome some of the domestic differences now that are emerging in both societies? So, not a direct answer to your question.
That's good.
I think Sheila's take is pretty much my own. I think implicit in my analysis of the Abe statement that I provided earlier is the fact that, I was grading him on a curve, but more importantly, it's the Korean analysis that we have to look at. Were they grading him on a curve? And I think my sense is, my takeaway from President Park's statement over the weekend, is that somehow he has passed an important test, a minimal level of test. I thought you were going to ask me what grade would I give him.
I could do that.
Oh, you can do that?
That could be my follow-on.
I'd give him a decent marks for effort, but an incomplete, and send him home to do a little bit more homework. And I think that's essentially what President Park has suggested that he do, reading between the lines of what she has said. So I think the jury is still out, but I'm very, very cautiously optimistic that the door has been opened just a crack to a better relationship between the two. On your question of whether the reverse curve exists and whether a DPJ government or a Murayama-like government would have issued such a statement, I think putting the two together side by side, I think there was a much more intense level of, what's the right word, emotion and sincerity in the Abe and the Murayama statement, which is not to criticize what Abe has done. As I said, I think he's come a long way and deserves credit for that, despite the incomplete grade that I've given him and the homework that he needs to do.
So Abe said everything Murayama said except for the apology part and more. So the person matters. And I think those who would grade on a curve and say, boy, this is better than we expected, which is most Japan experts, are doing that because of Prime Minister Abe's past statements. Those who say it's not enough, it's not sincere, are saying that because of Prime Minister Abe's past statements. But if you did a thought experiment, if you said, okay, what if this wasn't Abe? What if you had exactly this statement, and it was issued by, I'll throw out some potential prime ministers, Komura, Fukuda, Tanigaki, Ishiba, Aso. If any of those guys, all of whom could be prime minister, if any of those guys had issued the same statement, we would all say, yeah, that's about right. So as I said, I think this pretty much hit at the center. Murayama is the 1955 system, post-war, socialist, LDP, bipolar, Cold War context. There are no more Murayamas. And today, and I don't think it's just generational. I think it's the structure of politics and geopolitics. But I think this statement could have been issued by almost any prospective prime minister in Japan who's on the horizon, unless, I could think of a few exceptions, but I think most of the mainstream people, if Abe, was abducted by space aliens tomorrow, one of these guys I mentioned would be prime minister, and the same statement from them would have been completely expected and natural, I think.
But would it have gotten the same either positive grade or harsh criticism if they had given it?
Less so in both cases, I said, because Prime Minister Abe's past statements on this, but Prime Minister Abe's past statements on this were in the context of a statement by a socialist prime minister who in 1995 brought all the baggage of the Socialist Party to the statement, including opposition to the defense treaty with the U.S. and things like that. So the political context set Prime Minister Abe's generation of politicians, against the Kono and Murayama statements. It was not really about Korea or about China. It was about the ideological battle over whether Japan has the right to be a normal nation or not. And those politics colored the way that many in the current cabinet viewed those apologies, because it was not just the words in the apology, it was all the ideological baggage that the Socialist Party brought with it. That's history, that's the past. Murayama doesn't have to apologize. But it's a different context, and I think his statement is pretty much what mainstream prime ministers would have said.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm going to open the floor to questions. I'll start with the usual housekeeping of, once I recognize you, please wait for the microphone to come to you. State your name and your affiliation, and keep it short. Have it as a question rather than a speech. But even more so, given these issues, which are very highly controversial, highly emotional on both Japan and Korea, if you could sort of please keep your questions in the context of analytic questions as opposed to very strong remarks. So,
And if you're going to throw something, throw it at him.
so I see Chris had his hand up first, so if we could.
There's a big surprise now.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris Nelson Report. Thanks for continuing what I think has been a really rich discussion on all these things since late last week, and I really enjoyed printing, I think, about 50 pages of comments so far, and now we got some more. some of the feedback I've been getting that was not printable on request, don't print, is a lot of our Korean friends are feeling they've been sandbagged on this. That we made very clear in advance we want to move things forward. We want to find something positive in what Abe said, so therefore it would be good if you did too. And President Park certainly came through Saturday. We all agree on that. But this undercurrent of is worrisome. Does that keep the onus on us to not just have this sort of neutral, good offices stuff? We leaned on them to be positive. Don't we need to lean on Prime Minister Abe to take up Park's offer? And specifically, what do you think the Prime Minister should be doing? One of the things I had in my report last night from an anonymous contributor was Abe absolutely must reach out to her on comfort women and once and for all resolve this. And that's what he took out of what he heard on Saturday. Do you agree with that? Do you agree with that the U.S. maybe has incurred an additional burden by leaning on the rocks to be positive here? And if so, how does all this play out? Thanks.
Anyone want to jump in, Evans?
Let me start. I think there's been a lot of leaning by Washington in both directions, and lots going on in the background of words whispered in the appropriate ears and concerns expressed in both directions. While a lot of this may not be public, but I think behind the scenes there's been a lot of very helpful, I wouldn't call it even leaning or pressing or cajoling. I think there's been some good advice offered, including from those of us on the dais here. I would take issue with the notion that the Koreans somehow feel sandbagged by all of this. I mean, if you look at various statements that have been coming out of Seoul about what Seoul wanted and needed, one of the fundamental requirements that the Koreans made clear was a reaffirmation by Abe of all previous Japanese government statements. There have been plenty of editorials written in the Korean press suggesting that Abe was trying to undercut these statements and reject them and reverse them and rewrite them, et cetera, et cetera. He's done quite the opposite. He's reaffirmed them, he's associated himself with them, and they are now part of his legacy as well, since he signed on to them. And so I think it's a little unfair to suggest that somehow Seoul was sandbagged in all of this. I think there's been, as I suggested in my opening remarks, some very interesting and very helpful dialogue going on for the last several months between Seoul and Tokyo at a number of levels that have kind of teed up the environment that the two countries now find themselves in. There has been a gradual turning down of the acerbic rhetoric that we've heard, and turning up the volume of hope-oriented, future-oriented remarks. And so I'm a lot less cynical than some of your unnamed correspondents are about where things are and how they've come to this point. I think it's important for the United States to continue to do quietly what it has been doing, which is to continue this quiet dialogue with Seoul and Tokyo, and encourage them to do precisely what I think is going on right now, move things in a better direction and take advantage of this opening.
So I was in the NSC office for almost 5 years that drafted the statement out of the White House. And knowing how that office works and knowing Dan Crittenbrink and Chris Johnstone, who would have been responsible for this, I'm very confident that the Korean government, the Blue House and the Foreign Ministry was in probably daily conversations, as was the Gaimusho and Kante in Japan, with them about how this would play. So I doubt the Korean government was surprised. The Korean press probably was, because it's very sensitive and probably wasn't shared. And I think that President Park's statement, Foreign Minister Yoon's statement were well crafted, but I think, as I said, it was done with foreknowledge of how this would play.
And the Japanese foreign minister's phone call to
That's right.
To the his Korean counterpart, I think also helped tee this up in a very good fashion.
I don't have anything to add. I agree with both.
Michael Marshall, Global Peace Foundation. In many ways, the Abe statement is a product of an internal debate in Japanese domestic politics about how is Japanese history read? And it seems that in that debate, the nationalist right lost out. My question is about the 80% of the public on the polls, which obviously covers a spread of political views, who say they don't trust Korea, and the whole business of Korea fatigue. How does that play into the dynamics and the dimension of the statement and the Korean response to it? And what can move that attitude in Japan towards Korea? Because it seems to me that this is quite worrying, that there are that many Japanese who don't care much for Korea.
I'll take a stab at that since I missed the last round. So I think all of us are aware of the polling data, the binational polling data, right? And the Genron MPO series, right, is a great place to look at both sides and how they're trending. I think, I'm sure that everybody on this panel understands that when we go to Tokyo and talk to friends, both sides, right, of the political spectrum, not just government officials and policymakers, that the attitudes towards Korea are troubling. That there has been, I think, a deepening of mistrust and antagonism, and in some cases, open expressions of discrimination against Koreans. It's a difficult history for both countries. But I'm going to hold both leaders accountable for some of this, because I think the diplomatic estrangement between Seoul and Tokyo could have been a different story, and the domestic antipathies could have been much, much less harsh, I suspect, on both sides, right? And that's where I think, and again, I'm an academic, so I get to say things like this without responsibility, but I think political leaders ought to take that to heart, that when they decide that they are not going to speak to each other because their publics don't like it, they are also creating political opportunity inside their own domestic societies for the kinds of antipathies that we're seeing, again, on both sides, not just on the Japanese side. So there is responsibility here in diplomacy in large part, and I think that's one of the pieces of the puzzle that, again, I'm not singling out one leader or the other. This is a story that's been unfolding since, you can go back to Prime Minister Noda of the DPJ, that came up, Lee Myung-bak, right? So both Abe and Park inherited in some way this dissonance, but they are the only ones at the moment who can try and fix it. And I think both leaders now have a higher hurdle in explaining to Koreans and Japanese why their futures are so interdependent, or why their futures should be interdependent. So it's not a complete answer to your question about why that 80% exists. There's plenty of reasons that we can come up with in terms of war memory, et cetera, right? And mistreatment, right? But I think the real question is, how does it get fixed? And I think that 80% will shift in Japan, and others in the room may take issue with this, but I think it's movable. And I think that's Mr. Abe's inheritance here as well. It's not just the diplomacy. It's trying to advocate for and demonstrate that the Japan-South Korean relationship is in Japan's interests, but he needs a partner in Seoul to do that. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle.
Just a quick additional word. I agree with all of that. There's not only Korea fatigue in Tokyo, there's Japan fatigue in Seoul. And traveling back and forth between the two capitals in recent years, it's become very obvious to me that we've got a problem in both capitals with how they perceive the other side. It is a fact that there has been, I think, insufficient leadership exercised on both sides here, to be very frank. And I have tremendous love and respect for both countries, and I've served in both for many, many years. It is true that the two leaders who are in power now inherited a lot of dissonance from their predecessors, but on their respective watches, it got worse. And I think the good news coming out of all of this is that in recent months, it's become increasingly obvious that responsible people in both capitals, right up to the top, have looked at this deterioration of relations between the two countries that have so much in common in terms of, as I said in my remarks, shared values, shared concerns, and shared threats, that things have gotten so bad that it was time to try to arrest what some have described as a free fall in the relationship. And I wouldn't point to the events over the weekend as having turned the corner in this relationship. I think we've actually, several months ago, we began to turn a corner as the two sides recognized that something needed to be done. And the point that I want to leave you with here today is that the events of this past weekend, I think, have reaffirmed that both sides seem to have the sense that things should not be allowed to get any worse, and that there is some prospect that things might get better, and that we might be able to get that 80% number back in better territory.
It's a good question. I would characterize slightly differently the first part of your comment. I'm not sure the right wing lost, the far right lost, but I thought this statement sort of synthesized, brought the center left and center right together, and some of the wordsmithing people don't like allowed that. But on the question of Japan-Korea, it's I agree it's about leadership. I don't think it was about malicious intent. Prime Minister Abe made his first speech as Prime Minister the second time in 2013 at CSIS, and I moderated the discussion. And we told our friends in the Prime Minister's office that I was going to call on Victor Cha, my colleague, to ask about Japan-Korea relations so they would be ready and could set a positive tone, and we thought we were doing a good thing. And Prime Minister Abe said, "I'm glad you asked that question." And he said, "My grandfather, Nobusuke Kishi, was very close to Park Geun-hye, Park Geun-hye's father, and often said he was the most pro-Japanese leader in Korean history," which was sincere and positive and
Not very smart.
not the right message. And President Park also did things, particularly with Xi Jinping in Harbin, with statues to the assassin of Ito Hirobumi and so forth, that I don't think were done necessarily with a Japan message in mind, but were inflated by the Chinese. And so both sides had failures of leadership, not moral or failures, not malicious intent, but just too much familiarity, frankly. I mean, like Evan, have had a number of conversations with Park Geun-hye before she was president. I don't think she has an anti-Japanese feeling. She's quite pragmatic, would travel to Tokyo frequently. And Abe famously did very well with Korea his first time as prime minister. His wife, Akie, learned Korean watching Midnight Sonata and Korean dramas. I think it was just unfortunate, clumsy politics, in part because they thought they were so familiar as conservatives with each other. In Atami, in Shizuoka Prefecture, where I once was an exchange student and go from time to time for the hot springs, there's a hill where the first Korean woman pilot to cross the ocean that shall not be named between Japan and Korea, and in the fog crashed into this hill in Atami, and there was a memorial there. And in 2000, Prime Minister Mori and Kim Dae-jung went, and they built a Korean, have you been there? It's really beautiful. Yeah. They built a Korean villa and put up a huge stone forever pledging warm relations between the people of Korea and Japan. And, you don't see that now. You don't see that. So part of this, because it's about leadership, is setting the right tone. Little gestures like when the Prime Minister went to the Korean, I think it was the Korean embassy, right, on the 50th anniversary of the 1965 treaty back in June. Going to the embassy, that's not very, it's good, but it's not very, it's not gripping, it's not imaginative. So I think part of this will be to get past the grumpiness in the Cheongwade and the Kante and around the two leaders and start thinking really creatively now. And I think this statement, although it wasn't a home run necessarily, will make that possible, to think of the kind of gestures that would create the environment, which in my view have to precede to some extent a real addressing of the comfort women issue. I don't think the comfort women issue can be addressed and then you have peace parks and positive gestures. It's going to have to be iterative. And hopefully, that'll be some of the more imaginative, creative thinking that both capitals do. Have you been there? Right here? Yeah. Pretty nice. It's impressive. Yeah.
Junko Tanaka with NHK. Thank you very much for the great discussion. I'd like to ask about the Chinese Victory Day ceremony on September 3rd that's been discussed in this discussion already. I'm sorry, I can't offer any insight on whether or not Prime Minister Abe is going. And I thought the speculation by Dr. Green that he might go if there's a trilateral meeting on the sideline, maybe after the ceremony, is very interesting. My question is, what do you think President Park would do? Because there has been a report that Chinese government is obviously pushing her to go to come, and the U.S. government is expressing some reservation. So I'd like to hear your prediction or speculation. Also, how would the U.S. government treat this ceremony?
Let me take the first crack at that. I'm not with the government anymore. That's why I smile so much lately. And so I'm not going to speak for what Washington may or may not be doing. I have no knowledge of it. I think it's important to separate the visit to Beijing by either President Park or Prime Minister Abe from the military parade, the point that Mike made earlier. These are very, very different things. I think if Prime Minister Abe is to visit, I see no problem with a visit by President Park Geun-hye to Beijing. But the military parade, I think, is a very different issue, quite frankly. And if I were advising one side or the other, not that anybody has asked me to provide advice, but if I were, there would be a number of factors that I'd want to consider before approving the notion of a visit to Beijing. One of which would be the notion, is my counterpart from Tokyo or Seoul going? That's a pretty important factor right there, because I think it legitimizes the whole entire thing if both can go. But reflecting on the ROK government's position on a number of issues dealing with peace and stability and the future of Northeast Asia, if the goal is peace and cooperation and reconciliation in Northeast Asia, which is obviously a goal of President Park and her government, does her presence at a military parade further that goal? Personally, I think not. And so that would be one factor that I would consider. Speaking very frankly, how appropriate would it be for a Korean president to be at a military parade, if that's an option, that is hosted by the last country to have invaded Korea? Speaking very bluntly. The participation in the military parade, once again, this is separate and apart from a visit to Beijing. Being there at the military parade risks buying into the Chinese Communist Party's mythology about World War II and the resistance to Japan, that it bore the brunt of the battle and the fighting, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's problematic. And it also, I don't need to remind anybody in this room that the government in Beijing now did not come into existence until 4 years after the end of the war. So why are they celebrating? What are they commemorating here? And then there's also the symbology of tanks and troops rolling down the streets of Chang'an Dajie. For anybody who remembers Tiananmen, that's, if I were an advisor to either government, I'd say let's think twice before this. But once again, let's keep the issues of a possible visit to Beijing, especially if they can be done by both leaders, separate from the whole parade thing. I don't know how this is going to play out, but once again, if I were asked for my advice, those are the factors that I would provide to my bosses.
Yeah, I agree. There's the optics of participating in the military parade, and especially from standing at Tiananmen Square, for any democratic leader would be difficult, frankly. And I think that's why the European leaders are having a difficult time making decisions about how they want to think about the moment. On the other hand, I think there is an opportunity here, and it's a big one, if President Park and Prime Minister Abe want to take it. And that is that they do show up diplomatically in a separate capacity to talk to Xi Jinping about peace and stability in the region. Again, in my opening remarks, that may be too much of a dream, but I think it's an option that should be fully discussed and coordinated and considered. If it's going to be difficult to do, then of course, maybe another occasion. But if it's possible to conceive of coming together for the sake of the region, for a demonstration of that ambition on the part of both the President and the Prime Minister, I think we would applaud that. I would applaud it, certainly. And it would also, I think, ask of Xi Jinping a little bit of buy-in, frankly, to the importance of the trilateral relationship. I think there's one danger here that I see, and I don't speak for our government at all, but in that one of the great advantages of that trilateral forum is it allows China, Japan, and South Korea to build trust, but also to problem solve at the sub-regional level. So when they began that trilateral in December 2008, everybody thought it was just going to be about economics or cross-border issues. It very quickly turned into a conversation where there was a comfort level with talking about North Korea, for example. So the promise of that trilateral consultative venue is very important. It's even more important today. And I would urge both leaders in Tokyo and Seoul not to allow their relationship, again, to be have China at the axis of that relationship, that they must argue for defining that ownership of that trilateralism. Because I think if you allow it to be separated, and perhaps I'm speaking here to people who are thinking in Seoul, if you allow South Korea's relationship to China to be separated from its diplomacy from Japan, then you have lost in some ways your own initiative over the trilateral dialogue. But I think you've also weakened yourself over the long run. And the same goes with Tokyo. If you allow the estrangement with Seoul and only focus on China, then you too have weakened your latitude going forward. So I hope that this trilateral occasion, again, if we could see it happen in a constructive way on September 3rd or the morning of the 4th, I think all of us in this panel would be delighted. But at least don't allow the separation to continue in a way that's going to make trilateralism either unimportant or not possible at all.
So many of you probably followed the SICA summit last spring in Shanghai, which brought together continental Eurasian leaders for before that point, a very sleepy summit sponsored by Kazakhstan. But China hosted it last year, and the Chinese hosts pressed all the participating countries to sign on to a joint statement opposing blocs in Asia, which was an unambiguous attack on U.S. alliances, and calling for a new security system. Every leader, participant signed on, including U.S. allies like Turkey and Israel, who were on the other side of Eurasia. Korea was the only country that refused under enormous Chinese pressure. Korea is a very, very good ally of the United States. I was in Seoul at the time and asked friends in the Foreign Ministry and the Blue House if they were concerned that Beijing thought Korea would sign on in the first place. It got people thinking. I think that the Korean government has been a little bit incautious about allowing Park's good relationship with Xi Jinping, which is a good thing. It's not contrary to U.S. interests. But I think they've been a little bit incautious about letting China create a narrative in the region that the natural order in Asia in the future is going to be a continental Sino-centric system that Korea is moving towards. I don't believe that's true, and I don't believe that's Korea's position, but I know a lot of people who do. And so I think it would be disastrous for President Park to go to the military parade, and I don't think she'll go, right, for all the reasons Evan's very eloquently explained. I think it's risky for her to go on the margins. I think it's better to go after than before, because then you know what happened in the parade and you can put it in context. I would not, if I were in the Blue House, recommend going the day before. It's less risky, as we've been saying, if she does it in a trilateral. For Abe, it's a positive thing to have a summit in China around then and to participate in the commemoration of the end of the war. Extremely risky for him, though, because the foreign ministry, which is who Tokyo talks to, will not control the spin on that parade. And I think it's almost certain that it will be a very anti-Japanese, very militarized parade for a whole host of reasons in Chinese decision-making and domestic politics right now. But it's a lot less risky for Abe if it's the day after and he's there with Park Geun-hye. So, you know, I haven't thought about this a lot, but Sheila got me thinking, and I said 23%. But if you think about the logic of it, for Park and Abe, maybe we should all be
Yep.
pushing this and push it over 50%, because it would make a lot of sense. And it would have payoff for Xi Jinping too, I think, to
Yeah.
have them both there.
The day after.
The day
The day
before
after.
is not a good idea.
Emma, right here in the white shirt.
Let's talk to the schedulers.
Emma Shanlin-Avery from Congressional Research Service. Thanks to the panel, great discussion. I have two questions. One's just sort of bureaucratic. Is there any reason that the U.S. reaction came from the NSC spokesperson rather than the ambassador or the Secretary of State or wherever? I think after the Yasukuni visit, it came from the ambassador. So wondering about that. And then the other thing is just I'm struck by Mike's prediction that prime ministers won't apologize anymore. And I wonder if that's the case, if you could look back at this as a narrative where Abe sort of successfully lowered the bar on what you had to do, hence the grading on a curve, cleared the bar, but was then sort of a martyr for future, leaders of Japan. And is that a bad thing or a good thing? Thank you.
Can't tell whose smirk is bigger, Evan's or Sheila.
Go ahead, take that on.
All right. Well, our shadow panelist, Chris Nelson, will.
Why the NSC?
Yeah, actually, in my prep for this, as you guys know, I sent out messages on Wednesday and Thursday saying, Dan, send my reactions, okay? I included one to Dan, and he emailed back.
You realize you're outing him on television across Northeast Asia.
But he made it clear that it was going to be a unified administration state.
Right.
So, he didn't say why, but he made it clear, a day before, that it would be a single statement, so you wouldn't have dueling press conferences and where you use one word, a different word, all that. So, unified step. So,
Okay, any of you want to ask a question of Chris, just to sort of switch positions here?
I'm sure that the Japanese government wanted this to come from the White House.
Yeah.
They didn't want it, with all respect to Ambassador Kennedy, who's terrific, they didn't want it coming from the embassy or the State Department, both for the unified message, but because of the stature. It was not a White House statement, it was an NSC statement. That, now I'm being very bureaucratic, that could have simply been because getting a White House statement cleared in that system takes more than 2 hours. Unless it's like an attack on the homeland or something. And so as a practical matter, they needed to get it out quickly. And I think NSC spokesman is, believe me, easier than getting it through the politicos for a White House spokesstatement. On the apology question, are you asking our own personal opinions, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I'm not big on apologies in international relations. I think there are times when they're appropriate, but I don't think any country, anywhere, for anything owes perpetual apologies. There have been 50, roughly, depending on how you count in Japan. I think working on, apologies are extremely political. Even in the Korean and Japanese language, the way you apologize and so forth establishes hierarchy. It plays into a narrative about whether Asia is defined by the norms that Japan, Korea, and the US stand by, or by things that happened 70, 80, 90 years ago. If we want all of Asia to be moving towards the norms that we in Japan and Korea stand by, then we ought to be focusing on that. So for a host of reasons, I personally, not just in this case, but in general, am not big on apologies, and so I think it's appropriate. Is it a good thing? I don't know, but I think it's appropriate personally. But this is something where everybody will have their own personal view, and kind of like marriages, my view is I shouldn't always have to apologize, but I lose that one. That's different. Yeah.
Mike, can I ask you a question? Would you draw a distinction between future apologies, or the lack thereof, in Japan, and future statements that would include some of the themes that the Prime Minister touched upon on Friday, remorse and regret and reflection?
So I don't think future prime ministers will apologize, but I do think that future prime ministers might do what Koizumi did, it wasn't much notice, go to Marco Polo Bridge, talk about specifics, get into, and Abe did more in his statement, more specific references to bad things Japan did than any previous statement by any prime minister, foreign minister, or emperor. And I hope that that's the trend. and that future prime ministers and Japanese politicians, ambassadors, will talk more about more specific things. And that, to me, is much more fruitful in terms of repairing and healing than an apology, which is so political and so hierarchical and so much about power and legitimacy at a time when our focus on legitimacy should be about building norms that make Asia a safer and more prosperous place. I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah, I asked the question for a number of reasons, the most important of which is that if you look back at the statement from Prime Minister Abe, one of the building blocks of that statement is this notion of conveying to future generations the lessons we have learned. And I think you will probably continue to hear that in the future.
Just a footnote. Emma, you used the word martyr, right, in your question, and you know, none of us are going to be, well, maybe some of you will be here, sorry. I won't be here in the 80th anniversary. I certainly won't be on the panel anyway. Hopefully I'll be around. But I think it's hard to project forward what a Japanese leader 10 years from now, which is when the next statement would come, what context they're going to be working in, either diplomatically or at home. And I think that speaks a little bit to how much change we've seen. I mean, look at what was going on when Koizumi, or even back it up to Murayama, leaving the domestic politics aside. Look at the Asia that Murayama was looking out at, or that Koizumi was looking out at, and look at where we are today. And I think that context, fast forward 10 years from now, we don't know. And so I think that will shape whether or not a statement and what kind of statement is given. But again, to give, I'm not usually here supporting Mr. Abe, but I'm finding myself in that position today. In the press conference after his statement, he said something very important. First of all, in his statement, he said that we should never forget history, right? There was a very clear statement that Japanese should never forget, right? And it was their obligation not to forget. And in his press conference after, he said exactly what Mike was alluding to, which was that he was trying to bring the most Japanese that he could together under his statement. So he's trying to both bridge this right-left difference in definition of what was right and what was wrong. But I think he's also enlisting them a little bit in the education, the future generations, that this is something we can all come together as a common purpose, that we can teach and that we can make it possible. But he did take it on as our generation's responsibility, and he was on NHK the morning after the statement. He very explicitly said, our generation is responsible for making this happen. So it wasn't a I'm not going to apologize anymore kind of statement. He did sort of assume that his generation, and I suspect this generation of Koreans and potentially Chinese maybe, we're going to be able to work this problem. And that's a huge statement of ownership, given when we started this panel about Deng Xiaoping's statement about future, et cetera. It was a statement of ownership for this generation that I thought, again, got glossed over a little bit. And I'm not sure that that's how he interprets it himself. But it wasn't a martyr. You know, it wasn't like he was doing it for the right-wing cause or for the conservative cause. I think he felt a little bit more vested in making it possible. Just a little, I'm not a historian, but in international politics, after you have a war, you have a treaty, right, of peace. And the historians still write today about the treaty that ended World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and the punitive peace that imposed on the German people. Scholarship differs, historiography is changing, right? But it was a treaty full of reparations, right? Generations of Germans had to pay back those that they had used force against, right? And after World War II in the San Francisco Peace Treaty discussions, the costs of that heavy burden on future generations was fully discussed when it came time to think about reparations for San Francisco, right? So I think today we're looking at this other question of history, right? Is that now we don't have a treaty full of reparations for either Germany or Japan, the post-war period, but we still have this sort of sentiment of unfinished business, right? Again, bilateral treaties, Japan and South Korea, Japan and China, bilateral treaties for those who weren't at the San Francisco Peace Treaty table. But the basic understanding was that Japan would be welcomed back into the post-war peace without punishment, right? And here we still sit today talking about apology. And I don't want to say that that's the answer to the question, and I know the Japanese government gets a lot of criticism, some of it justifiable, I think, that they're being too legalistic in their thinking of what needs to happen. But you are talking about a two-tiered phenomenon here, especially for the Japan-South Korea relationship, especially for the women who suffered in the coercion of the battlefield brothels, right? Those women deserve justice. whether the treaty needs to be renegotiated or not. I don't think anybody is going to want to open up that again. But I think, again, both leaders on both sides have to figure out how their treaty language, right, and their state-to-state relationship perhaps differs from what is fundamentally, I think, at this particular moment in time, a question about whether these women, and there are 50, some of them, still alive, right, 51? And we've lost, in the last several months, we've lost several more. But those women deserve attention, with or without the legalisms, with or without the fighting it out in terms of who's more sorry or less sorry. And I think that's the piece of the puzzle that's going to be very difficult politically. But again, to go back to leadership, it's the part that really shouldn't be dismissed.
Okay, sir, right here.
Hyodong Roh with the Yonhap News Agency. Dr. Smith talked about the possibility of holding bilateral summit between the two countries. I think it is important to hold bilateral talks, but more important thing is what kind of agenda should be discussed in the meeting. So because if there's a summit and then another bad thing happens, there will be a diplomatic disaster to both countries. What do you think of that?
I'm sure everybody else has an opinion on that question. I think diplomatic disasters are part of a risk. I'm not a diplomat, and Evans is, so I'll let him talk about how risky your diplomacy can be. But I think you don't solve problems without risk, frankly, especially difficult problems. I thought it was interesting, and as you know, I've just written a book about Japan-China relations, not Japan-South Korea relations, so this is taking us a little step back. But many of us thought the Xi-Abe summit, what kind of conditionality would suffice, right? Well, the diplomats found a way around that, right? Mr. Yachi went to Beijing before the APEC summit, right? It forced the hand. The APEC summit was hosted by Beijing, but they came up with 4 points of agreement. Were they preconditions? Absolutely not. But we all know that they created the foundation for both leaders to be able to at least sit in the same room together. We all saw the picture, right? It was not a warm embrace. It was not a solution to the imperative of risk reduction, right? But it began the process. Now, I suspect that given the body language of the Hague Summit in the Netherlands last year, that I suspect President Park and Prime Minister Abe can get a little bit better body language. They did at that particular meeting. But I think engaging in the conversation, whatever those 4, 3, or 2 points may be, that the diplomats can work through, that's the beginning of the solution to the problem. I don't think you're going to have a prepackaged comprehensive solution prior to a summit, but I think you'll have a good understanding of where they want to go.
Just a quick response. I have a lot of faith in the creativity and the intelligence of Korean and Japanese diplomats, and coming up with a pretty good, substantial agenda for both countries won't be a very hard thing. In terms of the risk, I think the real risk for Korea and Japan in an era in which, in a region where we're seeing rising uncertainty and some rising threats, the risk is allowing Korea-Japan relations to continue to deteriorate in the face of that reality. There's the risk. And I think what we now have, thanks to some reflection on the part of the Japanese leader and some basically helpful comments that he has made on Friday, as well as the Korean president's remarks on Saturday, are two leaders who recognize those risks and recognize the need to arrest what had been a free fall in bilateral relations and turn things around and move them in a better direction. And so I have, as I said, a lot of confidence that the two leaders, having given their blessing, I think, is the way I would put it, to trying one more time to move relations in a good direction. Having seen that happen now, and having heard the leaders spoken, I'm very cautiously optimistic that perhaps we are on our way to turning a corner here.
Well, I know we have more questions, but I promised my panelists we'd finish by 11:30. So please join me in thanking our very esteemed panel.